The following video is another in a series about how to integrate Python scripting with ArcGIS. We will eventually get to some videos where we're actually incorporating Python into Arc using the ArcPy module. But before we get to that point, I'm going to come through a series of videos that just discuss basic syntax and the operating language of Python. As I will say in the beginning of each of these videos, I am by no means a coder. I learned Python as it relates to ArcGIS a couple years ago, and then since that point have just tried to teach myself and play around a little bit with the programming language and the syntax beyond ArcGIS so I could get a greater understanding. So I'm hopeful that those who are watching this video are coming to it to either learn some very basic Python or ultimately follow along the path I'm setting here to be able to incorporate it into ArcGIS. So in the last video, we were learning about some basic operands. I think I had called them nouns at the time, right? Strings, encased by two quotations. Anything or any character between them would be a string. Integers and numbers. That's an integer 1.1 would be a float. Putting things in brackets, right, they would be lists, right, all the individual items within a list separated by a comma. And then tuples was the other thing we discussed. And a tuple is very similar to a list. Stylistically, it uses parentheses instead of brackets. And functionally, it's very different because, if we were to make this list, 1, 2, 3, 4, a variable, right, you remember, a variable, right, we can set something to mean something else. So now whenever I call x, it knows what I'm actually calling is a list of these. Right, a list, we can add to a list. Right, I can say add 5 to a list, and then I'd say print x, and there we go. 5 is added to the end of a list. But a tuple does not let you do that. Right, that was the big difference. Oops, 1, 2, 3, 4. If I were to say y.append, right, I'm a little jumping ahead with these things called methods. We'll get to them in a later step, just to demonstrate a point here. It's going to get angry at me. And the reason it has no attribute append is because a tuple is meant to be a fixed order, right? So whatever's in the first position must always be the first, must always be the second, third, and fourth. A good example we always use of something like this is time, right? If you have a tuple that's storing time, and a lot of different people might be accessing it, you want a consistent system where the first number that comes up is always the year, right? Or the day, or however you want to define it. So today what we're really going to focus on, and write print. Excuse me if you hear some noise in the background. I got a dog in here with me. Occasionally you might see us use print, right? It's jumping ahead because we're not yet learning functions, but it's something that allows us quickly to interface with the graphical user interface so that whatever we're entering and typing can appear before us. All right, so operators are essentially ways to combine operands, right, or to modify operands. And there's arithmetic, plus, minus, division. You have comparison, right? I can compare two things, see if they're equal or one's greater than the other. You can use them for logical queries. And then one of the other big things they're used for is membership and identity, right? So if I have a list or a sentence, I can see if a letter or a word or a number falls within that. Right, so some of the basic ones, let's just start with ones that we would use for integers. Remember integers, right? Plus is a very basic one, and I'm sure no one's going to be too surprised when what returns to me is 2. Right? Or I could set it as a variable, 1 minus 3. And I can say print x, and x will always be -2. And now I can say x times 10, and I know what will return to me, right, will be -20. So those are the basic operators right there. Basic math for you. You can use division, so on and so forth. If you want to use an exponent, use 2, right? 2 to the 5th, that gives us 32. So that's the sense of an exponent right there. Moving on to strings, it's kind of neat to do this transition. You're going to see some of the same operators used here, but they're going to do something entirely different. 1 plus 1 equals 2. What does 1 plus 1 equal? Right, keep in mind, these are integers. That's their type. That's what drives them. That's what defines them. These are strings, right? They're characters encased in quotation marks. They have no numerical properties or value, and so when I do that, it mashes them together, right? So that's the purpose of the plus operator when you're working with strings, right? Blue plus cheese. Notice I put a space in here, right? You can encase or enclose spaces equals that. I could put great food, and great food equals blue plus cheese, and then I can call great food at any time, right? Now blue cheese is stored as a string. You can actually use multiplication too with a string, and let's see if you can figure it out. Right? So here we go, we're going to do that. Knock multiplied by 2, and I'm setting you up here. I'm sure you can imagine what's going to return is knock knock, right? So that's what a the asterisk or the multiplication will do for a string. It simply duplicates it. Another important one operator that you'll often use with strings is to test membership, right? A string and a list and a tuple, they're all called sequences, right? A string is a sequence of numbers, right? That was foolish, I'm sorry. A string is a sequence of characters. Some of those characters might be numbers, some might be letters, some might be spaces. Right here, it's C-H-E-E-S-E. So I could simply check my script, hey, is the character capital C in cheese? Yes, it is. Well, how about this? Is the word blue in great food? All right, remember earlier I said great food. It is in fact. Look, we're calling back to an earlier thing that we said. Earlier I said a great food, and I made it blue cheese. I'm asking it here, is the word blue within great food? Is the word green in great food? It is not. Is the word blue in great food? It is also not. Notice here that's because it is lowercase, so it's looking for an exact match here. One other final one that I think is very interesting, and we may actually dive into a lot deeper in a later video just because it's important, is what's called a slice. Right, so much in the same way as I said earlier, we'll just call X, right, or great food. Great food is blue cheese. Great food is storing a sequence, and that sequence is a string, and that string has a series of characters, B-L-U-E space C-H-E-E-S-E. There may come an instance that you want to actually call out only one portion of the sequence, right? One portion of your word. Or if you have a list, you might want to call out the 10th item in that list. And you do that with what's called a slice, right? So if you put 2 brackets at the end of something and a number in between, you're essentially saying extract or slice out whatever character or whatever item, if it's in a list, or is at that index position. So that's a tough concept at first, index position, because I bet anyone who's coming at this from the first time is going to say, all right, what's going to return to me is a capital B, but what's actually going to return to you is L. All right, so it's set up in such a way that the first index is actually the 0th index, right? So it starts at 0. So just something to kind of keep in mind there, right? And call it a series of them too. I can say 0 to 2. Right, and what's going to come back is BL, so it's not inclusive of that one. Right, so if I wanted it to be inclusive of what's at the second index point, I would say great food 0 to 3. And then what I'll get is BLU. So that's the concept of slicing there, right? Using the index value or index point of something to call out what it actually is. Some of the things that we've been doing right here, we can do the same thing with a list because it's also a sequence, right? So if I make my list, and my list is going to be very simple, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And I could say, hey, is 7 in my list? And it'll say, no, 7's not in your list. Oh, 3 is. 3 in my list. Yes. And maybe why don't we take my list and why don't we get out the first, let's get out the first 2. And what comes out is 1 and 2, right? It makes a new list calling out whatever was at the first two index points of my list, right? I can also concatenate, right? I'll say low list equals, low list is going to be 1, 2, and 3. And high list is going to be 100, 200, and 300. And there's no reason I can't say, hey, low list, add yourself to high list. And what we'd return there is it would merge them into one singular list based on whatever order. Right? So plus is very, very cool. Right? We can use it to actually engage in arithmetic if we're working with integers. But when we're working with strings and lists and tuples, or not tuples, sorry, because you can't modify them, but strings and lists, what it's going to allow you to actually do is concatenation, right? So concatenation, testing for membership, you can repeat, slicing out characters, all some of the best things that we're using operators for. Other operators, you can actually test for comparisons, right? This one's going to seem extremely simple to you right now. I'm going to say 3, and notice I'm putting 2 equal signs here, right? So earlier, what we did is we put 1 equal sign. You set 1 equal sign when you're actually setting a variable. You do 2 equal signs when you're trying to test for a comparison. And you're going to get a Boolean response, false. Obviously, that one is false. We never expected it to be. What about this one? That means does not equal, right? So that does not equal 7. That's going to come back as true. Well, is 3 greater than 7? False. Is 3 less than 7? We're now looking at these comparisons, right, getting these Boolean logical responses in the Python shell. So it doesn't seem as intuitive why we're doing this yet, but when we start writing more complicated scripts, this is going to play a really critical role when we start using iterative loops. So if we start asking questions like if, right? If my one thing does not equal the other, then do this, right? Or if my thing equals the other thing, do that. So this ends up being a really important operator as you move forward with scripts to start to get some logical arrangements, that will allow your script to do one thing versus the other.